Thanks, everybody. Happy to be here. Excited to talk to you about TruHealth, which is the new report that we're releasing from TruDiagnostic. So today we're going to be talking about that report. I am, as Quinn mentioned, Mike Mallin. I'm a physician, precision medicine physician, and chief product officer, chief experience officer at TruDiagnostic. So excited to talk to you today. Let's get straight into it. I'm going to talk about the report for the first half, and then I'm actually going to show you an example of a report during the second half of this talk, and then we'll do some. So to start off, if you've heard of True Diagnostic, you're likely familiar with our focus on biological age and as the leading epigenetic age company in the market. And you're probably also aware of our focus in science and research and large data sets and our relationship with the best research universities. But we're not talking about either of those things today. We're, at least not directly. We're something really big, something huge that we believe is going to change the face of medical diagnostics pretty much forever. Imagine with me for a minute a test that with one finger stick that's obtained at home can deliver you over 100 biomarkers, specific reasons for disease, and personalized interventions to reverse or prevent disease. Epigenetic test that reviews over 100 epigenetic biomarkers in an easy to read and an actionable format that will help you direct your patients, really like no other test. Before we get into all that, because those are some really big claims and big statements that I just made, I want to talk a little bit about the background and make sure everybody's on the same page. We can get to the point where we can actually back up all those giant claims that I just made. And let's start with what is epigenetics, check biomarker. And to talk about what an epigenetic biomarker is, we first need to talk about what is epigenetics. So epigenetics is the study changes in gene expression that are influenced by environmental and lifestyle factors. So your genetics may not change over your lifetime, but the way your body expresses your genes does change. Think of your DNA sort of as the ingredient list for a recipe. And if the DNA is the ingredient list, then epigenetics are the instructions on how to make that recipe. Depending on what instructions we use, those ingredients can create wildly different final products. If you throw it in a blender, you get a smoothie. If you put it in a pie crust, you end up with a pie. Principle is true with cells. So if our DNA encodes certain proteins, we get a neuron. But if it encodes other proteins, then we end up with a fibroblast. The neuron on the left has the exact same DNA code as the fibroblast on the right, but their epigenetics differ. The neuron needs to make different proteins from the DNA than the fibroblast does. And that's really what epigenetics controls. Epigenetics works in that way, sort of like a light switch. Pretty much every gene, or for every gene in your DNA, it can turn on that gene so that the gene is being used to make a protein, or it can turn off the gene expression so the DNA is not making that protein. And that's called a process of methylation, because that portion of DNA gets methylated or turned off, or unmethylated turned on, in order to determine whether that gene gets expressed or not. Methylation is really just the addition of that molecule to that location of DNA right before where the gene is typically coded. And it tells the cell not to express that gene. The molecule causes the DNA to sort of wrap up so that it can't be expressed and the particular gene can't be coded. Your DNA is methylated in a certain location really depends on a combination of a lot of things. Your parents' lifestyle, your particular lifestyle up to a point, your entire life, what you eat, how you exercise, medications you take, literally every other factor on how you live now and have lived up to that point is going to determine your epigenetics. In fact, your epigenetics are changing right now listening to this lecture instead of doing something else in your life. So literally everything that we do changes DNA or changes our epigenetics rather. Think about the different omics that are available to us in laboratory medicine. We've got DNA all the way at the top that doesn't change, right? That's your genes. We've got proteomics, metabolomics, and epigenetics. And the order that it goes in is basically DNA changes not at all. Epigenetics changes sort of the slowest, and then proteomics faster, and then metabolomics changes minutes to minutes. Interesting is where we typically measure things in medicine is in these markers of proteomics and metabolomics. And those things, turns out, are a little bit faster in terms of how often they change. So let's talk about this for a minute. Take the example of CRP. So your DNA can have specific SNPs in it that alter the way your CRP gene functions. And you can have a predisposition to higher or low CRP levels, right? CRP, by the way, is a measure of inflammation, if anybody doesn't know. Genetics can then change your DNA methylation if you smoke, for example, which would increase your CRP expression. Proteomics could cause an increase in CRP protein synthesis because of IL-6. So say you've got an infection that increases IL-6 levels, now your CRP has elevated. And then metabolomics sort of explain the changes in your body from that elevated CRP. So elevated lipid peroxidation, for example, would happen if you had elevated CRP levels. You can choose to measure any of the data points on the slide. DNA SNPs, epigenetics, IL-6 levels, CRP levels, lipid oxidation. We can measure any of those things. The challenge comes in when we consider timing. So if we're trying to diagnose an acute infection, maybe protein levels make the most sense. But what if we're trying to define something like the risk of disease, of chronic disease? The challenge is that we may not see our patients only every like 6 to 12 months. And we want a longer term picture of their CRP, not just what their CRP was at the very minute that their blood levels were drawn. So one advantage to epigenetics is that it appears to have a longer time frame when evaluating a specific biological process. So it gives us a look into how the patient has been spending the last several months rather than just the last few hours before their blood was drawn. In this, at True Diagnostic, we imagined what would it be like to have sort of a hemoglobin A1C for every biomarker, for CRP, for white blood cell count, for triglycerides. What if we could understand the normalized value of that biomarker over weeks and months rather than just a specific time point right when their blood was drawn? What we're talking about now is creating this concept of epigenetic biomarkers. So a CRPM instead of just a basic CRP, M standing for methylation. Epigenetic biomarkers that are trained against actual biomarkers and the diseases that we're most interested in. A CRP that averages all of your COPs over some time frame rather than just a single acute level. We're talking about what we're imagining exists. So this study, which is currently in preprint, leveraging DNA methylation to create epigenetic biomarker proxies that inform clinical care, a new framework for precision medicine. This is a study that we did with Harvard University that we're going to spend a few minutes talking about now to help you guys understand where epigenetic biomarkers came from. For this particular study, to create the epigenetic biomarkers, we started with training an AI algorithm against the MG biobank of about 5,000 participants with the following things. So we had their epigenetics, we had their clinical biomarkers, so things like blood pressure, resting heart rate, weight. We had their proteomics, things like CRP, IL-6, ApoB. We had their metabolomics, things like glucose, NAD, amino acids. And we basically used all of that information to train an algorithm to infer the actual blood levels of all of those markers based on epigenetics alone. So what that looks like is we took all of the patients with a normal CRP, to their epigenetic fingerprint. And we took all the patients with an elevated CRP and we looked at their epigenetic fingerprint. And then we took all the patients with a low CRP and we looked at their epigenetic fingerprint. And by comparing all of these different epigenetic fingerprints, we came up with what is the epigenetic fingerprint for CRP being normal, elevated, and low. That with 3,173 biomarkers. So we took them and created this data pipeline, basically, where we could push all of this information into the AI system and then rid of all those that didn't correlate well and keep all those biomarkers that did correlate well. And the ones that correlated well enough turned out to be 1,694 biomarkers. Just a quick view of how those biomarkers performed. So if we look on the left-hand side, that's this Spearman correlation is the correlated value. So how well the epigenetic biomarkers correlated with the observed markers or the traditional lab markers. So the higher on the graph here, the better they perform. So here, around 0.9, that would be the highest performing biomarkers and the lowest performing biomarkers down here. Remember, we cut everything off at 0.2, which is considered sort of a standard of where you cut off a correlate value. And then we looked at how did clinical markers perform, how did the metabolites perform, and how did the proteins perform. And you can see here, there's quite a few markers that performed extremely well when it came to correlation with the observed values. What's interesting, though, is that a lot of the biomarkers, a lot of the variables that didn't perform quite as well, that had lower correlations, are the tests that we would actually expect to not perform as well, because when you typically test them, you're in a fasted state. So, for example, serum lipids. Triglycerides are tested fasted, right? So anytime we have blood samples from people, they're tested fasted. Epigenetics, though, are looking at your triglycerides over some time period. Maybe it's the last weeks to months, and you're not fasted for weeks to months. So your triglycerides are traditionally way higher than they actually on your epigenetics than they actually are if you did a serum fasted level. So with epigenetics, we're getting a long time period of the markers rather than the short time period. And what we're finding here is that we've got excellent correlation between the epigenetic biomarkers and the observed biomarkers. We also looked at how well these biomarkers correlate with mortality. This is called a volcano plot. And what we're looking at here is basically the height of the marker means how significant it is. And then the distance from zero is how impactful it is. So what the hazard ratio or the odds ratio would be for that biomarker. This is observed biomarkers here, and this is the EVPs here. And what we find from this plot is that some of these EVPs are actually performing better than the observed biomarkers traditionally look at. Looking at that, we then went back and looked at association with mortality and diseases for all of these people in the biobank. We also compare correlations to the entire TruD cohort as well, so another 30,000 people. So we cross-validated the correlations. But looking at mortality, we found something really interesting. And that's that a lot of these epigenetic biomarkers perform better in predicting mortality than the actual blood level biomarkers do. So we're finding that in a lot of cases, the epigenetic biomarkers are actually better markers for disease and interpreting disease risk and disease diagnosis than the actual traditional blood biomarkers. We saw this with cardiovascular disease. Here you can see a lot of these are performing way better than the actual traditional markers, and then cognitive deficit. So we're learning that not only can we predict the traditional lab values with the epigenetic signature itself, but these epigenetic biomarkers are also proving to be better at identifying risk with hazard ratios and odds ratios. On to validate the study a few different ways as well. We looked at gene ontology, which is basically a fancy word for looking to see what genes are being regulated by those methylation sites and making sure that that makes physiological sense. Like, are those genes that we would expect in certain disease states? And we looked at things like alkaline phosphatase, which we found was linked to corticosteroid and glucocorticoids. We looked at hematocrit M, which we found was linked to hematopoiesis and leukocyte differentiation. We looked at systolic blood pressure, which is associated with peptide hormone secretion pathways. So we found that yes, the answer is correct, that a lot of these genes are associated with what we would expect based on the methylation marker we're looking at. So looked at clinical validation. So do these EBPs link with conditions and supplements? Found yes, xanthine M and urate M are both elevated in gout, for example. Omega-3 supplements increase DHA-M and EPA-M. So just like we would expect DHA and EPA to go up in the blood whenever you give somebody omega-3 supplements, we found that the same thing happens with the genetic biomarkers. In clinical trials, looking at panels, looking at CMP, CBC, lipids, over 90% accuracy epigenetic biomarkers when compared to standard traditional biomarkers. And then looking at longitudinal tracking. So if we look at epigenetic biomarkers over time, do they change the way that we would expect them to by increasing, staying the same, or decreasing? And we found that yes, they do change over time in the same manner. The outcome basically of this study is that we found that epigenetic biomarkers are capable of predicting traditional biomarkers with very good accuracy, and that they can predict disease better than traditional tests in a lot of cases and pass multiple rounds of validation. Brings me to sort of a dirty secret that we have in diagnostics, and it's not really a secret, I'm just ambitious here, but the reality is that no test is 100% accurate. And I think sometimes in medicine, we sort of forget this, especially with lab diagnostics. We get a normal CRP, we assume there's not inflammation. We get an elevated hemoglobin A1C, we assume there's diabetes. And I think we easily forget that these tests, and depending on them, that we forget that they can be wrong. Take a minute and talk a little bit about biomarkers in general. A biomarker is a measurable substance found in the blood that provides information about biological processes and diseases. That's things like hemoglobin A1C, CRP, and cholesterol. But why do we order biomarkers? Well, we order them to diagnose disease, to predict disease risk, and to monitor disease. Talk about that for a minute. Diagnosing disease, we tend to talk about sensitivity and specificity, or combine them and use a term called AUC, or area under the curve, which is sort of a combined performance metric of both sensitivity and specificity. So here we're looking at using 3 different biomarkers: random glucose, hemoglobin A1C, and the oral glucose tolerance test to diagnose diabetes. And we see here that basically random glucose has the lowest sensitivity, specificity, the lowest AUC, and we go up in performance as we go to hemoglobin A1C and an oral glucose tolerance test. However, we don't always use oral glucose tolerance test, and the reason we don't is because it's just more challenging to obtain. So a lot of the times we end up using hemoglobin A1C, even though it's not the gold standard for the diagnosis of diabetes, because it's a single test. You don't have to keep somebody in the office for 2 hours and do multiple sticks. It's cheaper and it's quicker. When we look at how our epigenetic biomarker performed, or hemoglobin A1C-M, it actually performed with a higher AUC than hemoglobin A1C or random glucose for the diagnosis of diabetes. Going through a paper, it remains clear that this is actually the case for a lot of our epigenetic biomarkers. More than half of them perform better in diagnosing disease than the actual traditional biomarkers, which is remarkable. And we're actually not the first people to look at epigenetic biomarkers. This has been done previously, although on a much lower scale. The Lothian bird cohort, a study was performed in them comparing CRP to cognitive impairment, and they found that CRPM related to cognitive impairment much better than CRP did, or blood CRP. Found that the CRPM was more precise than regular CRP by about 10%. So it didn't change between multiple tests as much as blood CRP did change. And they also found that another study, not the same study, found that CRPM was more closely associated with brain structure changes on MRI than traditional CRP. So if we compare CRP to CRPM based on their literature, we see that it's more highly correlated with disease, higher odds ratio for cognitive impairment. It's got a higher ICC or precision than blood CRP does. And it can be obtained by a finger stick, which is obviously an easier experience for the user rather than having to go into a mist. Really, what we're talking about here, to put it all together, is we're talking about better biomarkers at a lower cost and that are easier to collect. The TruHealth report is. We took those 1,600 different biomarkers that we got positive correlation from with some associated disease, and we identified the 110 most clinically actionable biomarkers and put them at Harvard study and put them into this test that costs less than $500, can be at home with just a finger stick of blood. And that's what we're calling the TruHealth report. So I would like to go ahead and share the report with you guys. What I thought would be really useful, True report, this is my report, real data. We'll go here and show us what we're talking about. So the report starts off looking at sort of what are epigenetic biomarkers, how do you compare them to serum levels, what is the Harvard cohort. We want to make sure everybody understands what data we're comparing people against. Go over sort of a quick biomarker overview of like, this is how to read the biomarkers, what's normal, what's out of range. And then we do a summarization. So we've taken all of the different epigenetic biomarkers for vitamins, amino acids, antioxidants, fats, and cellular membranes, and we've combined them together to give an overall score. So this gives the clinician a quick look particular category to understand where there's concern. So here you can look, for example, under nutrition and identify it. Mike's got some concern when it comes to antioxidants. You can go down and look at general health biomarkers and see there's also some concern around metabolic markers and stress markers and NAD metabolism and some supplements, and see that these other markers are in good range. And then the report basically makes specific personalized recommendations on the most actionable things in the report. So here it's identifying there's a B12 issue. I should be taking riboflavin, ergothioneine issue. I should increase ergothioneine in my diet. Amino acids like valine, oxidative stress marker, phenolate, and inflammation markers. Go through each one of those. The next section of the report actually goes through every epigenetic biomarker, and I dig the user out by describing the biomarker and then also identifying things that can be done to improve that biomarker. So we'll start with vitamins. Starts with vitamin A, which you can see I was in the normal here. So this is sorted out as a percentile, and this is a percentile versus the Harvard Biobank population. So 68%. The bank, so that means I'm obviously doing fine when it comes to vitamin A. I'm a little bit above average if average is 50%, but I'm not down in a concerning zone when it comes to vitamin A. However, when we look at riboflavin, looks like I've got some riboflavin problems. So 4% on riboflavin, this actually makes sense. Vegetarian, not a lot of B2 in vegetarian diets, could have something to do with why I'm low in riboflavin. This was actually news to me. I now take riboflavin, but we see here we've described what is riboflavin. We left the vitamin descriptions relatively short just to not clutter your page too much, but then we can make recommendations on some vitamin-rich foods, riboflavin-rich foods, as well as supplements that you might want to consider taking with that particular, For vitamins, we go through nicotinamide, panthenic acid, PPP, inositol, ascorbic acid. We've got two different ascorbic acid ones. Generally, these track really well together. We may end up removing one of them and just reporting on one in the future if necessary. But you could see, obviously, consume things higher in vitamin C and take vitamin C supplements are the number one recommendations. Vitamin D, alpha tocopherol, total cholines, betaine. This was another one that was a surprise to me. Obviously, easy to increase betaine in the diet or take TMG. Go through amino acids. We have a nice list of amino acids here, including all the basic ones as well as some additional ones here. I believe my valine was low, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, cystathione was low, so that suggests that protein synthesis issues. Oxidants is the next section. So in oxidants, we go some of the same repeated as antioxidants as opposed to vitamins. So you'll see retinol again, B2 again, vitamin C again, but then there's new things like alpha tocopherol, lutein, carotene diol, acetyl L-carnitine, extremely low in acetyl L-carnitine, which I've also started taking. Physical activity, aerobic exercise, and then of course you can supplement with it or take omega-3s, which can help increase it. Ergothioneine, a fats and cellular membrane section where we go over omega-3s, DHA, EA, omega-6, oleic acid, and then we also have PUFA, and SFA, as well as C15, which is this is stuff that's like hard to find to test otherwise. Glycerides as well is another area. And you could see we do our best to explain all of these things as well, because just in case people don't know exactly what these compounds are, this gives you an idea generally of what the compound is and then reasons it might be elevated, or is typically how we describe most of these. Phosphatidylcholines and then sphingomyelins. So have a section on lipid peroxidation. We thought it'd be interesting to show, not only what your lipid profiles are, but are they oxidized? And of course, is glutathione available to help reduce that oxidation as well? Serum lipid section, we found that we could infer lipid levels extremely well with the report, as well as their relationship to cardiovascular disease. So we've got ApoB, LDL-C, LDL particle size, VLDL, ApoA1, and HDL-C. So basically, an enhanced lipid panel is what we're talking about being able to present here, triglycerides. Got a blood pressure section. So not only can we infer systolic blood pressure, which didn't populate on my report, but should populate on all the others. So look at other compounds that can be associated with elevated blood pressure levels, like vanilla acetic acid, which would be elevated if someone had high blood pressure. Look at phenylacetylglutamine, and if elevated can lead to levels of blood pressure, as well as the actual biomarker for systolic blood pressure itself. So not only can we look at chemical compounds, but we can actually look at clinical markers like something systolic blood pressure. We could also do weight, for example, which obviously we haven't put in the report because you can just weigh somebody. So that's not super helpful, but it's nice to know, what is somebody's blood pressure at home typically? Are they in the higher range or are they in the lower range? Is this white coat hypertension, or is this just typically run? So we thought would be an interesting one to add. Markers of utility here: hemoglobin A1C, glucose. Now, we also added some additional markers like palmolacetylcarotene, leptin, and then phenylacetylglutamine, because we thought they might be helpful in terms of assessing overall metabolic health. Markers: white blood cell count, neutrophil count, lymphocyte count. You're basically getting great things from your CBC here, as well as CRP, a lymphocyte to neutrophil ratio, and systemic inflammation index, which are all helpful for monitoring, and CD4, CD8, which are all helpful for monitoring inflammation. Neurocognitive markers thought would be helpful for those people concerned about cognitive decline, looking at some of our transmitters like dopamine, as well as quinolate and neurogranin. T-beta, my TGF-beta is a little bit elevated, which is something I need to do something about, and progranulin, as well as direct inflammation markers. So again, we've got CRP, and then here we had IL-6, methionine, sulfone, serum amyloid A1B protein. Markers: cortisol, VMA, which is another marker for stress hormones, and toxins. So we can report on some of the forever chemicals like PFOS, PFOA, as well as HPMA, phosphate, and then lead. Really tried to do here, I feel like I'm just sort of like talking everybody with all the stuff that's on here. There's a uric acid pathway, there's mitochondrial function, there's oxidative defense, there's NAD metabolism. We can look at whether you're too much. Basically, this can infer if someone is taking too much NAD precursors, whether they've got inadequate recycling of NAD in their pathway. All those things are can infer from these reports, as well as their metabolic health and regular ketone levels, and specific supplements, alpha ketoglutarate, spermidine, creatinine, octane, all those things. So we've really tried to create a systems-based report that hits all of the highlights as much as possible with these EBs. We will be improving on this. This is literally V1 of this report. So if you can imagine, now we've got 110 exceptional EBs that we put into this report. from spanning vitamins to amino acids, antioxidants, fats and cellular membranes, lipid peroxidation, all of these general categories, we will be expanding on this. This will improve. We believe that the next step is moving from just telling what these particular markers are to actually define risk of disease. So what we found in the same data set basically is that we are able to predict disease better than traditional biomarkers. So the next logical step is, well, let's actually predict disease. So what we're working on now is the development of methylation risk scores, where we hope to come out with a report where we can actually predict the likelihood of someone contracting a disease based on these epigenetic biomarkers and based on the epigenome, rather than looking at traditional markers.
Welcome to Root the Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.